Hello. If you're that young girl and you're a single mom and you're past the point where there's anything you can do, don't make nearly enough money to buy the groceries and pay rent and come up with daycare, you work a couple of jobs just to pay somebody else to raise your child, you belong in this camp. The same with the young man. If you uh, are trying to support and come up with a bicycle for a toddler and support a wife and child, and you don't come close to making as much money, you belong here. We're gathering our gang together, and we're going to get you to start to comment. How much money do you make? How much you pay in rent? You're not supposed to be paying rent. You're over here. It's called home economics, and we have our own little world. And how much you pay for groceries and a dentist and a daycare. And we're going to start getting you to add the numbers up. Then we're going to start getting you to ask for reparations. And we're going to start getting enough money to support a wife and child. The guy, by the way, you ask yourself how many hours you have to work. We have about 3 dozen, half a dozen minute uh, anecdotes on two YouTube channels. The Priest and the Pimp is one of them. And the Priest and the Pimp Media Access.org is another, although I'm trying to put the two together. And so here we're going to ramble in the good sense of the word. We'll use our tactics and the things we learned from our anecdotes, and it's time to act. It's time for you to get up and do something. Home economics, to remind you, is, well, excuse me, we have our own little tricks here, our own little way of saying things. We'll put the priest on one side and the pimp on the other. And the priest says, say what you mean what you say. Everything else comes from the evil one. And there's a pimp, and he doesn't lie. He just doesn't tell the truth. He knows how to hustle, how to manipulate and intimidate people. And there's a flip-flop. We'll use our fancy graph. Put a little dot over here, and then a line in the middle, and a flip-flop lines out to the other side. And that flip-flop represents taking into account a sense of original sin. Straightening out our emotions, willing the good of another person, and doing it because Christ rose on the third day. A little trick, there's a priest on one side and there's a flip-flop. So if you're a young girl, sit in a chair and, well, in your mind, separate the act of sex from the act of getting the gal pregnant, and then draw a line out to the other side, and there's a pimp. And he says things such as, hey, I only meant it if I could get away with it. You're a decent human being, aren't you? Well, give me $20. And you'll be able to see the emotion in it. So if you happen to be listening to this and you happen to know a single mom or a guy, please start chiming in. Use that live chat and start coming up with the numbers. And then we can do something about it. You can do something about it. Just as a reminder, how does a pimp recruit a prostitute? It's a 3-step process. He separates a gal from her little group. He keeps her from physically walking in one direction or the other, and that's the first stage. From the gal's point of view, he interferes with her ability to walk in one direction or another. Then stage 2, he touches her in some fashion. He may shake her hand, but whether she wants to or not, but he doesn't let go. And so he goes from out there to here. And then the third stage, he'll say something like this, hey, I have a temper and I just don't know what I do and I have a temper. And then he says, right, and you have to agree with him. And he might jump at you as he says that. And from the point of view of the gal, that's you, she has this instantaneous decision to make. This guy's telling me I better be afraid of him or he'll kill me. He's bigger than me. There's nothing I can do about this. I better pretend so I can get through the moment. I can't pretend, so I better become. And if her attitude changes, that's it. He's got her. How a pimp recruits a prostitute. We're being a little vein here, aren't we? We're talking about some young girl being recruited. It's the same thing, the same tactics the communists use. It's the same tactics that's been used here in the United States when when some communist organizer gets a bunch of guys to go throw bombs in the street. It's the same thing. If you think about it, it's the literal opposite of Catholicism. Just find an old Baltimore Catechism, write down its literal opposite, and you're there. If you do it intentionally, there's sort of three worlds. There's the world, the chimpanzee side of us, and the definition of mental illness is the normal taken into the abnormal, from a cold to the flu to pneumonia. The Catholics say go back to being normal, and normal isn't normal, and normal is normal, but it's not good enough. And we'll use our earthly example. Fantasize about the gals until you become sexual, there's a sexual change in your body. Open your eyes and do it again, only this time you're trying to get the gal pregnant. And you'll see what original sin is with a snap of a finger. If you add to that decency, and then a formal argument trying to will the good of another person, and then the idea of a formal argument of decency. The Pope holds the moral high ground, so I choose to put the Pope in charge, and then suddenly I'm my own man, and the whole world changes. There are three natures, and there's two natures, and that's the second one, the God and country. Then there's the nature of someone who hustles, and they're either called a class of intellectuals or evil, depending on who's doing the talking. And then there's a chimpanzee side of us. All of this stuff actually happened in the United States, and I'm sure in Great Britain too. We're trying to get a gang from Great Britain because so much of this stuff came out of Great Britain. It started in the 1970s. In the 1950s, the Communist Party said they would overthrow the United States by about the year 1973, and they were very accurate and quite successful. That was when there was a profound change in our society. You could see it when it comes to you, the gal. There was the women's liberation movement, and it's hard to put an emotion into words, but they were quite vicious. They threw out God. They have no love in them. They have no empathy in them. They couldn't care less about other people, and they made money by forcing other people to work more hours. The sexual revolution, throwing out decency as a formal argument, and doing that because there's no God. In home economics, it worked something like this. There was the husband, and the husband made enough money to support a wife and child, to support the family income. And that is just terribly important. In the United States, we had a definition of middle class that was unique throughout the whole history of human beings on this earth, or very, very few. We actually had the repairman and the plumber and that sort of thing living in a house. And we had this huge middle class. The definitions in Europe and communist countries are completely different. And they threw that out, and it worked something like this. There's hubby came home and he had enough of a paycheck to support the family budget, and the gal, in a very real way, ran the household like a business. Then the gals, the women's liberation movement, entered the workplace. But the bum's rush there is that they didn't enter the workplace. They could have, if they wanted to. They could have said, I'll get a job and that pays the gas bill. I'll get a job that pays the gas bill. I won't have sex, and I won't have any children. And it would have worked out wholesale, but they didn't. And so they had an income, and the husband had an income. And for that brief moment, their income was the consumption income. And since their attitude changed, and since hubby was still getting the bills paid, they put their two incomes together, and they went out and they bought a duplex and started renting property out to other people. And so people who were at the bottom of that middle class could no longer afford to buy, and so they had to rent. And right there was the twilight zone moment, the thin edge of a wedge, the British would say. And then it turned into the lazy V. You could just see it go like this. They decided that women would be liberated. And in another way of saying that is they simply decided that they could cash in on it all and move into the foothills and become an upper class and a peasant and property class society. And there's an attitude with that, no love, no empathy, couldn't care less about hurting other people. And they did it and they won. They decided that you would live in poverty. They decided that you would rent property from them, and chances are very few people listening to this own their own house. It was a given in the 1950s in the post-World War II United States, and they threw that out for you. And they decided that you wanted to put your child in a daycare center, and so you could go to work in the factory or as a plumber, that sort of thing. They decided you would do that. If you don't like that, well, I'm sure that what's left of the women's liberation movement, I'm sure they'll give up their house. I'm sure they'll give up any stocks and bonds they have. I'm sure they'll go get a garbage sack and go form a class of peasantry beneath the class of peasantry they caused. I, by the way, don't believe a word I just said, but that's the sort of thing that has to happen. Remember from our anecdotes, what's wrong? They threw out God and country. They threw out those three things: straightening up my emotions, willing the good of another person, and putting the Pope in charge, that infusion that evidently you have to have in order to be normal and well-adjusted and have a normal supply and demand curve and home economics. Let's remind ourselves about economics. Home economics is as opposed to individual rights, and there are lots of words for it. That's the popular word around here. And you could see people living in the foothills, individual rights, and putting you and us into communist housing projects in places like St. Louis and Chicago. Or they live in the foothills and they put you and I into apartments. Whether they're called the bourgeois class or slumlords, there's two words that mean the same thing, and they're quite scoundrels at it. If you see them, you can see them on TV. You can just look over here and you can see their attitude, and look at the people in Congress right now. You can see their attitude, and it's all the same. We're picking on the gals because we're hoping you'll start typing into the live chat and saying enough is enough of this. But whether it's Harry the hippie or Al the Afro or Donna the feminist, it's the same group. I'll take a step back. I'll arrange things along the lines of the classic battle of good and evil, the priest and the pimp. And take a look at things from there. To say it again, we did have a revolution in this country. Courts came out in the 1970s and said, we decided there would be no religion in government. And in one night, in one decision, they threw out the very thing that made the United States such a magical place to live. Those three things in our shop manual world that makes up God and country. If you think about it, they took the stereotypical, straight out of the definition of a satanic church. That's what satanic is, the complete absence of. And in so doing, they threw out a judicial court, a court that will establish facts that are true as true. And they institutionalized a sophistical court, a court that will establish facts that aren't true as true. And the shop manual version of that is they institutionalized pulling a bum's rush. It was one of the big mistakes I made, and I just assumed, and I'll bet you and the overwhelming majority of people do too, that people who hustle, con, manipulate, and intimidate people are the bad guys. And that's not what and that was wrong. Communism does that to the hilt. If you've ever seen some of these books that teach you how to go protest and that sort of thing, Sal Alinsky and those sorts of things, they hustle. They don't lie. They just don't tell the truth. I can think back to my school days, and all these guys that were just scoundrels. They're the ones that did real well. And whether they were the Mexican guy or the white guy that went to the Ivy Leagues or the girl who's a feminist, they should all hate each other's guts. But in reality, they're just 2, 3 peas in a pod, and that's just the way it is. But not you. You've got to put shoes on that kid. That kid has to have birthday presents. Got to have something today. You have to have a family budget today. And you're just going to have to step up and say, enough of this. We're going to be a professional citizenry, and then a good husband and good wife, and then a good father and a good mother, a good provider and a good mother. And since 10-year-olds can't pay for their children, pay for their moms, somebody's going to have to get you a budget so you can run the household. That's you, by the way. If you don't want to be a normal, well-adjusted person, if you don't want to put its effort into it, it's an unnatural thing. And then go over there, go someplace else. This is for you. The physical act of getting the kids raised lines up with the physical act of the pleasures of sex, which lines up with the romantic side, and then the genuinely romantic side, the nuns and thing. It's the nun that causes all this to come into being and to begin with. If you look at it, those nuns are the absolute heroes. They poured out of the Catholic Church and out of schools. They were literally thrown out of our society. And they were the literal opposite of the leaders of the women's liberation movement. The women's liberation movement won wholesale. And you can see it. You see people actually living in the streets. You see piles of trash in the streets in the United States and Great Britain and lots of other places. You never dreamed of that. It was all caused by them. Just to say something else, it was caused by them. It was their choice. They had reached the crossroads and they simply chose to be a scoundrel, to be evil. They didn't have to be. That they chose. And they got away with it, among other things, because those courts said that there would be no religion in government. Those courts said so. We can get away. We have to get away with it because we can get away with it. It's a communist thing to push society that way. I remember hearing on the news that Dan Rather, if you're old enough to know who he is, he was fond of doing what seemed like passing the word, and he was constantly people tried to get on him for being very manipulative, even though it was the news, just like they do today. Just like they do today. Anyhow, he looked up at the camera, paused while giving the news, and had a smirk on his face and said, "We're in a consumption society." And then he went back to the news. I remember it to this day because you wonder what in the world a consumption society is. They didn't teach us that in school. They made us do it, or they insisted on doing it and didn't teach us that. Those university professors are hellacious. They're as bad and worse and as guilty as human beings get. Those people who in the 70s were just getting started, they're the ones who are the university professors and head of the businesses today. Take a look at all the famous of the gals that are heads of universities, and the gal who's the head of the Treasury Department who's a trained communist, and all these gals, and they're absolutely well, they won. They got what they wanted, and you and I are paying a horrible price for it. And the same is true with the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Mexican movement, and you can't say white guys. White's a reference to practicing virtues, but whatever you call them, I call them Billies after Bill Clinton. The same is true with Joe Biden and all these people. Here in Tucson, this house that you see behind me was built in the 1950s, and it was built to get people out of poverty and into plenty. There was a professional gal who ran the house, this guy. This is a house I grew up in. Our dad was a repairman. 2 doors down was a milkman. Up the road was a guy who worked in a feed store, and there was a plumber next door. You get the idea. This world is completely gone. If you walk around now, you'll see people buying the houses. Most of them renters. I mean, most of them bought it to rent out. And they'll build a house in the backyard, and the standard of living plummeted. It's turning into a slum straight out of my school days. And the people who own it, they go up in the foothills and they collect rent. That sort of thing is what we had a Revolutionary War to stand up to. Remember, they're the enemy. One of us is committing treason. It's not us. I remember going down years ago. When our mom was alive, I took her to the city council when they were trying to stand up to this stuff, the neighborhood watch, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't. Nobody could stop them. It would cost too much money. They would take you to court and all sorts of things. You wanted to say, look, they threw out the very basic stuff of our society, a normal supply and demand curve, home economics. They threw it all out, and yep, that's what they did. Well, we're getting, it's about 25 minutes, so we're going to end this. So it's only been a handful of times we've come on the air. We'll try and be on the air in London at 7 p.m. Fridays, Saturdays, and 4 p.m. in the afternoon on Sundays. And I think that's 2 o'clock Fridays and Saturdays in New York, and 11 o'clock Sundays. And so please pass the word and gather our gang together, and we'll just get a group and say enough of this is enough. No more living in housing projects, no more renting, no more I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to end up sitting here living in the streets. We'll turn around and just so it said, we know exactly what's wrong, exactly what to do, and exactly how to do it. What's wrong? They threw out God and country. And I'll remind everyone, and including myself, that all this happened in the 1970s. They threw bombs in the streets for the violent overthrow of the United States government, says Angela Davis, who's a professor. And I see her a couple of years ago. She must be in her 70s at least, and she's putting her fist in the air, getting people to throw bombs in the streets of the riots they had, and getting $30,000 a speech for it. She's one of those people that got everything they wanted. They would have tore it all down if they hadn't got everything they wanted, said Donna Shalala, the first Black Surgeon General. If people would just try communism, says Jane Fonda, sitting on an artillery piece in North Vietnam. We've rioted, just so it said, Jane Fonda went to North Vietnam while we were at war with these guys, and standing up for the North Vietnamese. And she said, now that we were rioting in, it had to do with Cambodia. There was lots of supply lines, and the United States was bombing the supply lines, and they protested like mad in the United States. And then Jane Fonda said, we stopped the bombing. Now we have an equal footing. Let's go. In other words, she was a Tokyo Rose, they would say. She was literally campaigning for the North Vietnamese, and they were throwing bombs in the streets in order to stand up for the communists, and they won wholesale. Yeah, how's that working out? Terrific for Jane Fonda and Angela Davis and Donna Shalala. The rest of you are going to end up pitching a tent by 100,000 seat football stadium. But not us. We have a plan. We know just what we're doing, and it involves you. You're just going to have to lay down the law and say enough is enough. This is a budget I need to get into to run a household, to get everybody out of poverty and into plenty. And you're going to have to be a guy and says, that's enough. No renting property, no nothing. This is how many hours I have to work. And then we'll start changing things around in a big way. That we can do. So I hope you'll join the gang in the playground. We'll see you. See you tomorrow.